In today's video, I'm going to tell you the detailed story of Yuriko, a Japanese schoolteacher turned military translator who was captured during World War II. She expected silence, shame, and execution. But when American guards told her and 50 other female prisoners they could sing their traditional folk songs freely in the camp, she was convinced it was a trap. What happened next shattered everything. These women believed about their enemies and revealed how something as simple as music became the most powerful weapon against decades of propaganda. This is the untold story of how song broke through walls of hatred. The expectation of death, October 1945. The island of Kyushu trembled in the aftermath of surrender. Yuriko sat among 52 other women in a bombed-out schoolhouse, now converted into a temporary holding area. She was 24 years old, a literature teacher who had been conscripted to translate intercepted American radio communications during the war's final year. Around her sat factory workers, telegraph operators, and anti-aircraft spotters. Women pulled into service when Japan's manpower ran dry. They had all heard the stories. For 3 years, officers had lectured them about American savagery. Propaganda films showed women being dragged through streets, beaten, violated. Radio broadcasts described prison camps where captives were starved and tortured for entertainment. The message was always the same: death before dishonor. Capture was unthinkable. When Japan surrendered, Yuriko's commanding officer had handed each woman in their unit a small cloth pouch. Inside was cyanide, wrapped carefully in rice paper. He told them it was a final gift from the emperor, a merciful escape from what awaited them. That night, Yuriko had held the pouch against her chest and prayed for courage. Now, as American trucks appeared on the horizon, many women clutched similar pouches. Some whispered final prayers. Others simply wept, too exhausted for fear. Yuriko closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's face, certain she would never see her family again. The truck stopped. Soldiers jumped out, rifles slung over shoulders. The women pressed their foreheads to the dirt floor, trembling. This was the moment. This was where it would end, but the rifles did not fire. Instead, a voice called out in broken Japanese, "Stand up. You are safe now." The first crack in the wall. The American soldiers were younger than Yuriko expected. One had freckles across his nose like a schoolboy. Another kept adjusting his helmet nervously. These were not the cold-eyed demons from the propaganda films. They looked tired, dusty, and surprisingly uncertain. A medical officer stepped forward, a Red Cross band around his arm. Through a translator, he explained they would be examined for injuries and diseases, then transported to a processing camp near Fukuoka. No one would be harmed. Food and shelter would be provided. The women exchanged confused glances. Michiko, a telegraph operator, whispered to Yuriko, "It's a trick. They're making us comfortable before the executions." But as the hours passed, the executions never came. Instead, the women were loaded onto trucks with canvas covers to shield them from the rain. They were given canteens of clean water and crackers that tasted of salt and butter, luxuries they hadn't known in years. When one woman fainted from exhaustion, 2 soldiers carried her gently to a shaded area and called for a medic. Yuriko watched everything with the careful attention she'd once reserved for translating enemy communications. Every detail was analyzed, every gesture scrutinized for hidden meaning. But what she saw made no sense. The Americans treated them not as hated enemies, but as people who needed help. That night, in a temporary shelter, the women huddled together and whispered theories. Some insisted the kindness was temporary, a psychological tactic before the real horror began. Others wondered if they had died and this was some strange afterlife. Only a few dared to consider the impossible, that they had been lied to. Part 3. The Camp That Defied Belief. The processing camp sat on the outskirts of Fukuoka, a sprawling complex of wooden barracks surrounded by fences. As the trucks rolled through the gates, the women steeled themselves. This was where the facade would drop. This was where the true nature of their captivity would reveal itself. But inside, the camp looked nothing like the hellish prisons they'd imagined. The barracks were simple but clean, with real beds and blankets. Electric lights hung from the ceilings, a luxury Tokyo itself had lost during the war. There were bathhouses with running water, latrines that didn't overflow with filth, and a mess hall that smelled of cooking food rather than decay. Fumiko, who had worked in a munitions factory, walked through the barracks in stunned silence. She ran her hand along a wooden bunk and whispered, "My brother died on Okinawa. He never had a bed this good, even as a soldier of the emperor." The abundance was overwhelming. At dinner, the women were served rice, vegetables, and actual meat, portions larger than many had eaten in months. American guards stood nearby, but they didn't watch with cruelty or suspicion. They simply ensured the food line moved smoothly, occasionally smiling at children among the prisoners. Yuriko accepted her tray with shaking hands. She expected the food to be rotten or poisoned, but when she saw the guards eating from the same pots, she cautiously took a bite. The rice was fresh, perfectly cooked. The meat was tender. Her eyes filled with tears, though she couldn't say whether from relief or shame. That night, lying on a real mattress beneath a clean blanket, Yuriko stared at the ceiling and confronted a terrifying thought. If the Americans had lied about nothing so far, perhaps everything else was a lie too. The impossible freedom. The true shock came 3 weeks into their captivity. The women had fallen into a wary routine, work details to help with laundry and food preparation, medical checkups, English lessons for those who wanted them. The fear of execution had faded, replaced by cautious confusion. They were prisoners, yet they were treated with more dignity than they'd known in their own military service. Then came the day an American officer, Captain Morrison, called an assembly in the central courtyard. Yuriko translated his words for those who didn't understand English. She expected new rules, restrictions, perhaps assignments to harder labor. Instead, Captain Morrison said something that made her stumble over the translation. "We've noticed some of you singing while you work. We want to encourage this. Music is good for morale. You're welcome to organize singing groups, practice traditional songs, even perform for each other if you'd like." The courtyard fell silent. Surely she had mistranslated. Surely he meant something else. But the captain continued, smiling slightly. "We know you've been through trauma. Music can help healing. We won't restrict your cultural practices unless they cause genuine harm. You're not slaves here. You're people waiting to go home." After he left, the women stood frozen. Haruko, a former schoolgirl who'd been drafted into coastal watching duties, was the first to speak. "He's giving us permission to sing our songs, our Japanese songs?" "It must be a trap," Michiko hissed. "They're testing our loyalty. Anyone who sings will be marked as unrepentant militarists and punished." But Yuriko wasn't so sure. She'd watched Captain Morrison's face as he spoke. There had been no calculation there, no hidden malice. Just a tired man trying to make a difficult situation more humane. Part 5. The first forbidden note for days. No one sang. The permission felt like a loaded weapon pointed at their heads. They moved through their routines in silence, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then, one evening during recreation hour, something unexpected happened. A young woman named Hana, barely 18, began humming softly while mending a torn blanket. It was a lullaby, the kind Japanese mothers sang to their children for generations. The melody drifted across the barracks, simple and achingly familiar. Other women looked up, startled. Michiko shot Hana a warning glare, but the girl seemed lost in memory, her voice growing slightly stronger. The lullaby spoke of cherry blossoms and spring rain, of a world far removed from war and ash. Slowly, tentatively, another voice joined her. Then another. Within minutes, a dozen women were singing softly, their voices weaving together in harmony. Tears streamed down faces, but the singing didn't stop. Yuriko's throat tightened. She wanted to join them, but fear held her frozen. This was forbiddance. This was cultural expression the enemy would surely punish. Any moment now, guards would storm in with rifles and the illusion of safety would shatter. But the guards didn't come. The song continued until it reached its natural end, trailing off into silence. The women looked at each other with wide eyes, hardly believing they were still alive, still unpunished. That night, Yuriko couldn't sleep. The lullaby echoed in her mind, tangled with everything she'd seen since capture. The food, the medical care, the kindness, and now this. The freedom to sing their own songs in their own language while imprisoned by the enemy. Nothing made sense anymore. And that terrified her more than any threat of execution ever had. Part 6. The walls began to crumble after Hannah's lullaby. Something shifted in the camp. The women began testing the boundaries of their supposed freedom. Small groups sang while working in the laundry. Others hummed traditional melodies during evening recreation. Each time they braced for punishment. Each time none came. The American guards not only tolerated the singing but seemed to enjoy it. One young soldier, Private Chen, would stop his patrol to listen when the women gathered for evening songs. He didn't understand the words, but Yuriko saw him nodding along to the rhythms, a slight smile on his face. One afternoon, Captain Morrison approached Yuriko during her translation duties. "I've been hearing wonderful music from the barracks," he said. "Would your group be willing to give a formal performance? Maybe for the whole camp? We could set up a stage in the courtyard." Yuriko's mind reeled. A performance? A stage? For their captors? Why? She asked bluntly, forgetting the respectful distance usually maintained between prisoner and officer. Morrison looked surprised by the question, then thoughtful. "Because you're human beings with culture and dignity. Because you've been through hell and music might help. Because we're not monsters, no matter what you were told." That last sentence hung in the air between them. Yuriko stared at this American captain, this enemy, and saw something that shook her to her core. Genuine compassion. She translated his offer to the other women that evening. The response was chaotic. Some were excited, seeing it as a chance to reclaim a piece of their identity. Others were suspicious, convinced it was elaborate humiliation, that they'd be laughed at or mocked. Fumiko stood up angrily. "They want to parade us like trained animals, to show us off as their conquered pets." But Hana, the young woman who'd first dared to hum that lullaby, spoke quietly. "Or maybe they just want to hear us sing. Maybe that's all it is." The simplicity of that statement silenced the room. Could it really be that simple? Could the Americans really just want to hear music? Part 7. The performance that changed everything. They decided to perform. Not everyone agreed, but enough women wanted to try that they formed a small choir. They practiced for 2 weeks, choosing traditional folk songs that spoke of mountains, rivers, and seasons, songs that had nothing to do with war. Yuriko, with her teacher's background, helped organize the group. Michiko, despite her suspicions, had a beautiful voice and reluctantly agreed to sing lead on several pieces. Haruko taught the others hand movements to accompany the melodies, traditional gestures that told stories without words. The night of the performance, a makeshift stage stood in the courtyard, illuminated by electric lights strung overhead. Chairs had been set up for the American soldiers and officers who wanted to attend. Yuriko's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. As the women took the stage in their plain prison clothes, she scanned the audience. Every American face looked curious, some skeptical, others genuinely interested. Not one looked cruel. Michiko began the first song, her voice wavering at first, then strengthening. It was a folk song from northern Japan about snow falling on pine trees. The other voices joined in harmony, and slowly, Yuriko felt something shift inside her. She wasn't singing for the Americans. She was singing for herself, for the piece of her identity that had survived the war. The second song was livelier, a harvest celebration full of rhythmic clapping. Some of the younger women smiled as they sang, caught up in memories of festivals and simpler times. The American soldiers watched in rapt attention, nobody laughing, nobody mocking. By the third song, Yuriko noticed tears on American faces. Private Chun, the young guard who'd listened to their practice sessions, wiped his eyes openly. An officer in the front row sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable but intense. When they finished, silence hung over the courtyard for 3 heartbeats. Then the Americans erupted into applause. They stood, clapping enthusiastically, some whistling their approval. Captain Morrison walked onto the stage and bowed respectfully to the women, his hands clasped together in the Japanese gesture of thanks. Yuriko felt something break inside her, some final wall that had been holding back the truth. These were not monsters. These were not demons. They were men who appreciated beauty, who recognized humanity, who could be moved by songs from a culture they'd been fighting against. Part 8. The truth they couldn't deny. After the performance, everything changed. The women no longer moved through the camp in fearful silence. They sang while they worked, taught each other regional songs from different parts of Japan, and even began creating new melodies that spoke of their strange experience as prisoners who were treated like guests. The Americans encouraged it all. They brought materials for the women to make simple instruments, a bamboo flute, drums fashioned from supply crates, strings for a makeshift shamisen. Guards would request specific songs, asking through translators for the one about the mountain or the fast one with clapping. Cultural exchange flowed both ways. Some American soldiers taught the women English folk songs. Others shared music from their home regions, blues from the South, work songs from factory towns, ballads from farming communities. The women learned that America too had traditional music. Stories told through melody that had nothing to do with war or conquest. Yuriko found herself in the camp library one afternoon, a luxury she still couldn't fully comprehend. The Americans had stocked it with books in Japanese, magazines, even poetry collections. She pulled a volume of American poetry from the shelf and read translations that spoke of freedom, individuality, and questioning authority. These concepts, which Japanese propaganda had called weakness and chaos, were celebrated in American culture. She thought about the newspapers she'd seen, where journalists openly criticized their own government. She remembered the elections she'd heard about, where leaders could be voted out of power. She recalled Captain Morrison telling her that in America, people could gather and protest government decisions without being arrested. All of this contradicted everything she'd been taught. Japan's strength supposedly came from unity, from unquestioning loyalty, from the divine emperor. But America's strength seemed to come from the opposite, from diversity, debate, and individual liberty. And America had won the war. That night, Yuriko wrote in a diary the Americans had provided, "We sang our songs today, and they listened with respect." They did not demand we sing their songs instead. They did not mock our traditions or try to erase our culture. They simply let us be Japanese while treating us as human beings. I don't understand how the enemy shows us more humanity than our own officers did. I don't understand anything anymore. Part 9. The Letter Home. In early 1946, the Americans announced that prisoners could write letters to families in Japan. Mail service was being restored slowly, and there was no guarantee letters would arrive, but they were welcome to try. Yuriko sat before a blank piece of paper for hours, pen trembling in her hand. What could she possibly tell her mother? How could she explain what she'd experienced? Would her family even believe her? Finally, she began to write, "Dear Mother, I am alive and well. The Americans have treated us with unexpected kindness. We have food, shelter, and medical care. They let us sing our traditional songs. They gave us books and paper. I know this will be hard to believe, but I have been shown more humanity as a prisoner than I knew existed." She paused, tears blurring the words. Then she continued, "I think we were lied to about many things. I think the war was built on lies. I don't know what kind of Japan I'll return to, but I hope it's one where we can learn from what I've seen here. I hope it's a Japan where daughters are valued as much as sons, where questions are welcomed instead of punished, where strength comes from kindness rather than cruelty." Around her, other women wrote similar letters. Some spoke of the food and medicine. Others mentioned the respect shown to them. A few, like Haruko, wrote about the singing and how it had helped them reclaim a piece of themselves they thought was lost forever. When the letters were collected, Michiko approached Yuriko quietly. "Do you think they'll actually send them? Or was this just another test?" Yuriko thought about everything she'd witnessed. "I think they'll send them. I think that's what makes them different from us. They don't fear the truth.